Welcome back to the Data Chronicles brought to you by Hogan Lovells Cadwalader. I'm Charmian Aw, and this is our APAC Spotlight series, where we look at what's shaping data and technology law across the Asia-Pacific region. Today, we're diving into one of the most talked about topics in our field, artificial intelligence. We will discuss the myriad frameworks in APAC and how various governments are seeking to regulate AI. Together with my colleague Ciara O'Leary, we will discuss China's layered regulatory architecture, Japan and South Korea's early mover AI promoting laws, Vietnam's recent law on AI, which largely mirrors the EU's, the upcoming rules in Thailand and Malaysia, Singapore's framework on AI governance, and other sector-focused approaches. So let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast, Ciara.
Thanks, Charmian. It's great to be here and thank you for having me.
We're going to be talking about artificial intelligence today and the regulation of AI across APAC. Could you give us a 60-second version of what is actually happening on AI regulation across APAC right now? And how does it feel different from, say, 12 months ago?
The main thing to keep in mind is that jurisdictions in APAC are moving at different speeds and in different directions. Think of it in three buckets. The first bucket being the hard law jurisdictions. So we have China that has released a stack of binding AI rules. We have Korea that has come up with a prescriptive binding AI law. We have Vietnam, which in March released its binding AI law. And now we have, just in the past month, Thailand released a draft version of what is set to be a binding AI law. So we have the hard law camp. We also have the soft law camp. We have countries like Singapore, which has released predominantly voluntary, non-binding guidance, but still at pace. And we have countries like Japan, which do have an AI Promotion Act, but it's focused more on promoting AI in society rather than, enforcing specific obligations on AI users, deployers. And it's intentionally non-punitive in nature. And then thirdly, we have countries that haven't quite picked a lane yet. So we have Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Australia, places where we see a lot of policy initiatives around AI, potentially some non-binding voluntary guidance. And then the second thing is the sectoral overlay. So we've been seeing a lot of guidance come from, in particular, financial regulatory authorities, healthcare regulators. In terms of what has changed over the past 12 months, I think there's three things. I think the pace of change. So over the last 12 months, Korea's AI law, Basic AI Act, has taken effect.
Right.
The Vietnam AI law has taken effect, and Thailand has introduced its new draft. I think extraterritoriality is also worth noting. So Korea and China have provisions which catch overseas providers. And Vietnam, interestingly, has a provision which requires certain players of high-risk AI to have a local contact, essentially, in Vietnam. And then finally, enforcement. I think we're moving beyond just policy discussions and consultations, and regulators are now laser-focused on what enforcement is actually going to look like.
Thank you for indulging me on that question. I think it's absolutely right. I love the way you have given us a roadmap across the entire landscape. So look, we're going to switch it up a little bit, and I'm going to do a myth or fact exercise with you. It's going to be really fun. But what we're going to do is I will give you a statement, and you're going to tell me whether this is a myth or a fact. So my first statement is APAC has very few binding AI laws.
Myth. I think the conception that APAC is entirely soft law is extremely outdated. China has binding AI laws, Korea, Vietnam, and now Thailand. So I think the hard law camp is only growing, and definitely myth.
Got it. South Korea and China have the most prescriptive AI laws in APAC.
I would say fact, but Vietnam is quickly entering that picture as well. So it's true that Korea, under the AI Basic Act, does have differentiated obligations for high performance, generative AI, high impact AI. China as well is highly sophisticated, and it's tailored its AI laws to different technologies. So it addresses everything from recommendation algorithms to deep fakes to generative AI, and now anthropomorphic AI, which is a really big fancy word that basically means human-like AI. So think like AI human companions or humanoid robot. Very sophisticated and prescriptive. But Vietnam is entering the picture as well. In its AI law, it has a low, medium, high risk tier classification. I think it is true that a lot of the detail is played out in the enforcement decrees.
Sure. Most AI regulation in APAC comes from privacy regulators.
This one's myth. So privacy regulators are important. They're a big part of the picture, but they're not the only part of the picture. So if we look at somewhere like Singapore, the Infocom Media Development Authority has issued the Model AI Governance Framework and the Agentic AI Guidelines. Somewhere like Vietnam, the Ministry of Science and Technology has played a large role in administering and enforcing the AI law. In Korea, the Ministry of Science and ICT has played a large role in administering the AI Basic Act. I think it's also worth mentioning here the sectoral regulators, like the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Hong Kong Monetary Authority. They've issued guidance on AI.
National security is a major driver of AI regulation.
Fact. In some jurisdictions, this is explicit, while in other jurisdictions, it's more subtle, but it's still there. In China, national security considerations are woven throughout the entire regulatory framework. In Vietnam, the AI law expressly references national security and has prohibitions that are aimed at protecting national security, public order. In Thailand's Draft AI Act, there are actually data localization obligations on vendors contracting with government agencies and critical information infrastructure operator, which really demonstrates the strategic importance of controlling access to sensitive data. Governments seeing AI not only as an economic opportunity, but also as a strategic asset that has implications on national security and national resilience.
The future of AI regulation in APAC will focus only on high-risk AI systems.
I would say this one is a myth. So while risk tiering is becoming more common, especially in jurisdictions that are influenced by the EU AI Act approach, it's not the only way. So Korea does have a risk tiered framework. Vietnam now uses a high, medium, low risk model, but I'd say that's only one regulatory approach. So China, for example, regulates vertically by technology type, and Japan has deliberately avoided a risk-tiered model at all.
Right.
And I think even in risk-tiered systems, obligations extend beyond high-risk systems.
Right.
So for example, Korea has a category for high-performance AI.
Generative AI is regulated the same way as traditional AI in APAC.
This one is also a myth. So generative AI is AI that's used to analyze or classify. Think things like credit monitoring, fraud detection, whereas generative AI creates text, audio, images. Regulators are increasingly seeing that generative AI presents a distinct set of risks, whether this be hallucinations, deepfakes, copyright, misinformation concerns. And that is why we're seeing a dedicated set of Gen AI rules emerge across APAC. Singapore released guidance on the use of personal data in Gen AI. Vietnam's AI law has requirements for labeling Gen AI content. So I think the answer is that regulators are seeing generative AI as a separate category of its own, and they're regulating it in a different way.
If you are EU AI Act compliant, you're basically fine in APAC.
This one is also a myth. While it's true that EU compliance will take you a lot of the way, it won't take you the whole way. Korea and Vietnam that have very distinct concepts from the EU approach. For certain high-risk AI deployers, you will need to have a commercial presence or appoint an authorized local representative in Vietnam. Korea has classified them differently. Is it high impact? Is it high performance? So these risk classification tiers don't map neatly, and they mean different things.
AI can be considered separately from data protection and cybersecurity.
Myth. In practice, AI doesn't sit in a regulatory silo. Most of the real obligations and enforcement risks still come from data protection, cybersecurity, consumer protection. and intellectual property rules.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that we can see across the region, AI regulation is being integrated into personal data regulation.
So China has personal information security specification,
Which the most recent draft amendments to this incorporate AI requirements directly into what is a personal data framework. So under the draft, AI systems that perform deepfake biometric editing, things like voice cloning and face swapping, are required to notify users, obtain separate consent. So this is an example of AI regulation being integrated.
into what is fundamentally a personal data regulation.
So South Korea's AI Basic Act operates alongside its personal data regime, and Vietnam's AI law expressly ties compliance back to data privacy, cybersecurity, and intellectual property rules. So more often than not, when an AI issue arises, it's also a privacy and cybersecurity issue at the same time.
Final statement, a voluntary AI framework cannot create real legal risk.
So this is also a myth. Voluntary doesn't mean optional in practice. So for example, Singapore has the Model AI Governance Framework, which is technically voluntary, but it is treated as a benchmark for what responsible AI governance uses. China has some recommended standards, but these do serve as like a practical compliance reference, while guidance like the Monetary Authority of Singapore's might not be binding, but it still meaningfully shapes supervisory expectations. Even though we have some of these voluntary frameworks around APAC, they are the only yardstick for regulators.
Yep.
They are being used to assess what reasonable behavior actually looks like.
That's a great answer. Okay, so now we're going to dive into our question and answer. That was a lot to digest, but great food for thought, I thought. But one of the main things I think that we want to talk about is, compared to, say, the EU AI Act, right? Because that's always one of the most frequently asked questions we get from clients. They have done compliance programs with stuff in the EU. So predominantly it has been the GDPR to date. And then more recently with the EU AI Act, they might say we have done, something along the lines of, trying to align to the requirements there. How do you see that translating into APAC?
So I think the short answer is it translates a little bit, but not completely.
Right.
We can see the EU's influence across APAC, but every jurisdiction has adapted it in its own way. One thing that has traveled well is the idea of risk tiering. So we see risk tiering in Korea. There is high impact AI, high performance AI, generative AI. Vietnam has similarly borrowed this approach with its low, medium, high risk tier classification. And Thailand is following suit in its new draft. We're seeing increasing convergence around the same red lines, such as manipulation, deception, exploitation of vulnerable groups. Vietnam's AI law has a good example. It prohibits using AI to disseminate fake content capable of causing serious harm. I think the third is transparency. So across APAC, we're seeing different versions of the same underlying theme. People should know when they're interacting with AI or when content has been generated by AI. So China has content labeling requirements, Korea has meaningful explanation obligations, and Vietnam requires labeling and markings for AI-generated content. So at a fundamental level, the EU's approach is technology neutral and horizontal. But that is not necessarily true in APAC. China regulates vertically and by technology. There are different regulators for different industries and different rules for different industries. We have the algorithmic recommendation rules, deepfake rules, generative AI rules, anthropomorphic measures. And somewhere like Japan remains deliberately pro-innovation and non-punitive in nature. And one aspect of this, which remains to be seen, I guess, is whether the EU AI Act will create a similar Brussels effect that we saw with the EU GDPR. Are countries in APAC and around the world going to follow suit, or are they going to do it their own way? I think it remains to be seen.
Let's talk about something that keeps coming up, right? When we talk about AI, it's like innovation versus regulation. Obviously, I do the air quotes deliberately there. But is anyone in APAC genuinely striking the balance well, do you think? Or is it always a trade-off?
I think a number of jurisdictions are striking the balance really well. If I had to start with one, it would be Singapore. So the Model AI Governance Framework and Agentic AI Guidelines have practical tools for AI adoption, but without creating significant statutory friction. So these guidelines, they're iterative, they're pragmatic, and they evolve as technologies change and emerge over time. Korea and Vietnam are taking a slightly different approach. Both are trying to hardwire innovation support into binding prescriptive legislation. So Korea has measures to support AI, sandboxes, industry development programs. They're built directly into the AI Basic Act. And Vietnam has taken a similar approach. I think when it comes to innovation versus regulation, China is also striking a balance between the two. And a good example of this is in the recent anthropomorphic measures, which explicitly encourage the use of anthropomorphic AI. These are things like AI companions and humanoid robots. I think the real test will be to see how the enforcement actually develops over the next year or so. That's often a really true reflection of where the balance between innovation and regulation has been struck.
I think that's a good point. So now APAC is often described as a fragmented regulatory landscape. Is this true also for AI, and how should organizations navigate this?
Yes, it's definitely true from an AI regulatory perspective as well. There is a lot of fragmentation. To solve for this, there are three practical things that we should focus on. The first being build once and adapt locally. So if you already have an AI governance program, start with that and add local requirements as necessary. I think the second thing, map extraterritoriality and local presence requirements early. And I think the third thing is don't forget the sectoral overlay. Right. In financial services and healthcare in particular, the sector-specific rules are where some of the most detailed expectations sit.
So let's bring this back to business, Ciara. Who should care about AI regulation in APAC? And where are we seeing the greatest impact?
There are a few sectors that are feeling this more than others. The first is financial services. So regulators are increasingly asking how AI is being used in areas such as credit decisions, customer interactions, fraud detections, and automated advice. In healthcare and life sciences, whether it's diagnosis, triage, medical devices, drug discovery, regulators are paying attention to how AI is being deployed in these very sensitive scenarios. The third is employment and recruitment, human resources, increase in AI-driven recruitment, candidate screening, and workforce management tools. And I think across all of these sectors, we're not just using AI to analyze information, we're also using AI to make recommendations, interact with customers, and perform actions on our behalf.
I couldn't agree more. We hear a lot about these principles in AI, right? Like, so transparency, fairness, accountability, and explainability. Could you explain to us what these concepts mean?
I think these terms get thrown around a lot, and it's worth unpacking them. So I think transparency is really about visibility. Good example of what transparency really means is Singapore's recent guidelines on the use of Gen AI in chatbots. So these guidelines require it's called a chatbot information card. It's been helpfully likened to a nutrition label or a medicine label, including the most important content about how the chatbot is using your information is what transparency really means. Organizations using AI need to understand whether their models produce biased or discriminatory results, and they need to be able to demonstrate that they are able to mitigate for these potential adverse impacts. Accountability basically just means that somebody is taking responsibility for the decision-making process. And then finally, explainability. Explainability isn't about giving somebody access to the source code. It's just being able to explain in plain language how a decision was reached, what factors were at play, and what factors influenced the decision, and evidence that in some form.
Got it. So just a couple more questions from me, right, Ciara? Let's talk about enforcement. Are we seeing active enforcement of all these AI regulations in APAC at the moment?
Yes, we are, but it's not always happening through the AI laws themselves. So if we look across the region, there's a few places where we are seeing what I would call, enforcement pressure. So China is a very active AI regulator, particularly the Cyberspace Administration of China. Korea has been quite active, particularly in intersection of AI and privacy, particularly around training data. And Vietnam is also worth watching closely because while its AI law is now in force, many of the detailed obligations are yet to play out over the coming transition period and through future implementing measures. So I think the takeaway would be don't wait for the first massive AI specific fine before taking action, because in many cases, enforcement actually comes through privacy, consumer protection, discrimination, or just supervisory expectations long before an AI regulator gets involved.
I think that's very, very useful advice. So looking ahead, where do you see the momentum happening in APAC that people aren't talking about enough?
I think there's a few markets that don't get enough attention. Let's say India and Indonesia, they don't have a binding prescriptive AI law, but there's a lot of AI policy activity, a growing national AI agenda, and in India in particular with the DPDPA coming into force, an evolving privacy framework that will inevitably impact AI. We've also seen very recently in Australia, there's significant government attention on AI infrastructure, data centers, and AI safety. And then there's Vietnam, which has moved faster than I think anybody expected in a very, very short period of time. It's moved from high-level principles to standalone AI law with a risk-tiered classification.
And finally, which APAC regulator is doing the most interesting work on AI right now?
I might be biased, but I do think Singapore is doing some really interesting work. So Singapore has released guidance on the use of agentic AI that goes one step further, that can plan and make decisions. Think like a travel assistant that doesn't just offer you recommendations, but can actually book your holiday for you. And regulators globally, we just haven't seen guidance on agentic AI like this. We're also having some very difficult conversations here. There is a liability lacuna when it comes to an autonomous agent that can act on its own. Some of our traditional liability frameworks, like let's think of tort, for example, concepts like foreseeability. How do these square with an autonomous agent? And Singapore has been leading the discussion around how to understand what the liability position should be for these autonomous agents. There's a few other regulators I'd keep an eye on. The Cyberspace Administration of China, we've seen a lot of regulatory activity from them. And Vietnam's Ministry of Science and Technology is definitely going to be one to watch as the next wave of Vietnam's AI law implementing measures begin to land.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your astute observations with us today, Ciara. We'll have to have you back on the podcast for future
Absolutely no
episodes.
worries, Char. It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much.